Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 43 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, I'm here to tell you I'm really glad to be back here, sitting in front of this microphone and not trying to figure out my cameraposition.com blog. I'm hoping this didn't interfere with too many people's connection with the cameraposition.com website, but man, did I have a whole bunch of problems over the last couple of weeks, and I think, in fact, I know that I have it all sorted out now. Upgraded the WordPress blog software, messed around with a whole bunch of stuff. So hopefully those of you who had been having trouble getting the feed for the subscription and things didn't seem to be updating and yada yada. So anyway, I'm hoping that that's all behind us now and we can concentrate on talking about the creative side of photography. But I'll tell you, here's one of the things that I found interesting as I was screwing around with this, web interface and trying to figure out how to upgrade and upload files in FTP and all this other junk. Ultimately, what I really just wanted was a simple, easy to use website to be able to post camera position and other bits and pieces of things on there. So that got me to thinking about the technical interface in the world and about how ultimately what we want as creative people is a simple solution to technical problems. We want to be able to not have to think too much about the technical issues in photography and in our lives. So what I started thinking about is something that I had promised to do a while back on an earlier episode of Camera Position, and so I'm going to kind of start fulfilling that promise here with this episode that talks about the zone system of exposure. And again, don't forget that what my objective here is the creative aspects of the medium, and yet I think, and I think all of us can probably recognize this, that there is an aspect of creativity to the technological problems of photography. And so what I thought I'd do, and I've got a couple of things lined up for you here. I'm going to talk about the zone system a little bit through this episode of Camera Position, but I also have a PDF file called the Zone System Handbook, an introduction to the zone system that I have as a PDF. It's available as a download link on the cameraposition.com blog. So you'll need to mosey over there and grab that document in order to have a lot of what we're going to be talking about here make some sense. So take a look at cameraposition.com at the blog post for this podcast, and you'll find the PDF. And this is a part one, and a part two, which will be more specific in nature, will come up hopefully in a week or two. So I'm going to start out here with this idea of seeing and photographing. And of course, our problem with seeing and photographing is that when we see something we want to photograph, what our primary objective is, wow, that's really beautiful. I really want to make a photograph of it. And in our heads, there is this idea of what it is that we'd like that photographic image to look like. But sometimes the technology of photography stands in the way of allowing us to get exactly what it is that is in our mind's eye. So what the objective of the zone system is to make the post-production part of photography, the part that happens after the shutter closes and we're back in our chemical darkrooms or in front of our computer screens, to make that part of the experience something where A, we know things are going to work and we don't have to worry about, gosh, did I get that exposure correct? And B, we can make that experience of working with that image after the fact, after the exposure has been made, whether it's in a computer darkroom or a literal chemical darkroom, we can make that experience a creative process. It's not going to be a sort of toss me a lifesaver, I've got a problem, this file isn't correct, or my negative is too thin, or my negative is overexposed, or my file's histogram doesn't look right. The objective is to get rid of that problem. I would rather not have to worry about it. I'd rather concentrate up front on the idea of the photograph, the thing that made me interested in making a photograph in the first place. and put all of that technological worry into the back of my head. And then in the darkroom or the computer, I get to begin to explore another creative aspect. And that creative aspect is doing the most with the information that I have given myself out in the field when making a photograph. So I have found, and it's intriguing because this idea of the zone system is generally considered to be something very specific to the film photography world, and more particularly the black and white film photography world. And of course, that's because the process or the procedure of the zone system is a kind of a codification of a variety of sensitometry and chemical ideas that was put together by Ansel Adams and Fred Archer and a number of other people quite a long time ago, somewhere in the early 1940s. So the idea here of looking at this in 2007, some people are going to say the zone system. Well, isn't that just for film? And in fact, no, it's not. It's for digital. It's for film. It's for color. It's for black and white. The objective is to help us understand the exposure chain and how things work in terms of how the camera functions and how the camera sees light and how digital sensors see light and how film sees light and so forth and so on. The PDF that I have prepared for you all has some basic information in it that's going to be obvious for a lot of you in terms of shutters and apertures. And the basic concept here is, as probably most all of us know, is that shutter speeds and apertures exist in a relationship of 1 to 2, so that when we open up a full aperture or close down a full aperture, we are doubling or halving the exposure, cutting it in half, making it twice as much. And the same deal with shutter speeds. When we move from one shutter speed to another, a 60th of a second to 125th of a second, for example, we are either doubling or cutting in half the amount of light. And obviously, we've been involved in photography for a while, which I'm assuming most of you have, that we understand that those shutter speeds and apertures can, especially on our modern cameras, have some half stops or half shutter speeds, or in most cases, in contemporary cameras, have third stops or third shutter speeds. And that's because camera manufacturers over the last, maybe 10 years or so, have worked fairly diligently to put together a whole series of things that all make sense together. And the things that make sense together have to do with third stops. And the third stops have to do with ISO, or if you're an older photographer like me, ASA, the standard that we used to use here in the US, ASA, which then became the International Standards Organization's numbers, all sort of came into line with ISO and ASA now being the same numbers. And some of you may be old enough and from other countries remembering DIN, but now ISO, or some people say ISO, but I always say ISO, is the standard, and those numbers also are in 1/3 stops. So when we move from ISO 100 to ISO 125, we are making a 1/3 stop, or 1/3 of a shutter speed, 1/3 of an aperture. And we again tend to refer to things with the word stop because that sort of has become the sort of universal language to describe these units that we're dealing with. So one stop more exposure might be one stop slower shutter speed or one stop bigger aperture. And a third stop could be expressed either as a fractional number of shutter speed, or a difference between one whole aperture and another whole aperture in a third stop, or as one ISO number jump. So the PDF handout kind of goes through some of those basic things, and it also goes through some things about the way in which light meters work. Now, light meters are kind of curious things. All of our cameras have them for the most part, if unless you're shooting, as I often do, with large or medium format cameras that do not have them, in which case we use handheld light meters. So Light meters are these curious objects with an interesting history, and uh, even the modern ones now have very accurate computer controls and memories and so forth and so on. But the basic concept that a light meter continues to do all the time, every time, is that when we point a light meter at a scene, it tries to average out what it is that's in the scene to 18% reflectance. 18% reflectance. That is the sort of standard of photographic reflectance that light meters are tuned to see. 18% or middle gray. Now, the intriguing part about light meters is that since they are set up to look at the world and interpret it to be middle gray, if you point a light meter at somebody standing in front of a darkish background and they're wearing a medium color shirt and they've got a medium color hair, that ultimately that averages out to be probably pretty close to 18% gray. Well, the problem is that what happens if that person puts on a white t-shirt and stands in front of a white wall and they have silver hair and pasty color skin? Well, suddenly the light meter says, wait a minute, there's way more light here than there was before. What am I supposed to do? I guess what I'll do is I'll give this photographer a lesser exposure. And even if the light has not changed, even if the quantity of light falling from the sky or incandescent light bulbs or fluorescent light bulbs or whatever, even if the quantity of light hasn't changed, the light meter says, wow, there's way too much light here. I'd better make an exposure for this photographer that accurately records the scene because, of course, it thinks the scene should be 18% gray, middle gray. And that's all well and good if, in fact, it should be. But most of the time in that situation, it shouldn't be. Invert the problem and put somebody in a black sweatshirt against a black wall or a dark colored background. And what the camera says is, wow, really not enough light here. I'd better force this photographer by giving him some choices in his exposure controls that will allow enough light into the camera, because by golly, there just isn't enough light. And what I see, I want to make into middle gray. Well, of course, it's going to give us an exposure that will render whatever that subject is as middle gray. And the problem, of course, is that the subject isn't middle gray. It's dark. It's black stuff. It's black sweatshirt, and we don't want that sweatshirt to look gray because, in fact, it's not supposed to be gray. The problem is further compounded by the fact that many people use their cameras on automatic exposure. And so if you're not really paying much attention to what it is that the camera is setting, what aperture and what shutter speed, and are instead primarily concentrating on the visual aspects of the photograph, because that's what we're programmed to do. That's what we want to do, right? We're photographers, we're creative. We want to spend our time looking at the visual aspects of the subject. So we're not paying too much attention, especially if our cameras are set on some sort of automatic setting. So we need to get around the problem of the light meter being fooled into making incorrect exposure suggestions, because we need to remember that we're smarter than light meters. And we need to fool the light meter back by making sure that the light meter has a limited amount of information to work with so that we can give it the information that we want to give it. Well, what is that information? What is the information that we're going to give it? Well, if the light meter's job is to see the world and make it 18% gray, well, one solution would be to give it 18% gray. And probably many of you have, and if you don't, you probably ought to obtain one. You may already have a gray card, an 18% card. You can purchase them from nearly any camera store, just about anywhere. And an 18% gray card is a sort of industry standard that allows us to give the light meter exactly what the light meter wants to see. So one of the easiest ways to solve this zone system problem is to pop an 18% gray card right into the scene, into the lighting situation that you're in. Make sure that it's in the same amount of light that your subject is in, so that it's not in shadow or not in bright sunlight if your subject is not in shadow or not in bright sunlight. And take a meter reading, filling your frame with just the 18% gray card. Nothing more, nothing less, so that none of the background is visible. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're giving the light meter exactly what it is that it expects to see. And obviously, the solution then is that you do exactly what the light meter says to do. The light meter says, f8 at 125th of a second, and you're giving it the exposure that will produce what the light meter, or giving it the subject that will produce exactly what the light meter expects to see. And so what you get is a correct exposure. Well, of course, the next question is, what happens if you don't happen to have one of these gray cards along with you? What if you don't feel like going to buy a gray card? What if you forget it and leave it in another camera bag? What do you do? How do you solve this problem? Well, that's where the zone system really begins to shine. And the idea of being able to take and make an exposure reading from something that is not necessarily a gray card, and that has importance to you as part of the subject, is really the sort of important part in how the zone system works. So let's take a look at this system, this idea, and see if we can make some sense of it. In devising the zone system, what Adams and his cronies wanted to do was to create a method by which photographers could cut through the technical problems of the medium and get on with making some pictures. They wanted photographers to be able to stop worrying about the mechanics of the medium and have confidence in the science that they were using, but be able to use that science for self-expression. So what they did was they divided up the tone scale of a photograph from black to white into 11 separate areas that they called zones. Now, you may see some other variations on the zone system that say 10 zones, and that's fine. The method that I'm going to give you here is an 11 zone system. If it's a 10 zone system, eventually you'll see how that all sort of works in. They used the word zone to describe these areas of tone because it allowed them to talk about an area of similar adjacent tones, not a particular exact tone, not a particular value, but rather an area or a group or a zone of tones. They also decided to name the zones with Roman numerals because they figured photographers, we already had enough Arabic numerals to deal with in f8 and 125th of a second and so forth and so on. So they used Roman numerals, and for some of you, you may not have encountered Roman numerals for a long time, but try not to say IV and V and VI. Instead, sort of remember back to those early school experiences, 1, 2, 3, etc. But that's why they're numbered with Roman numerals typically, is so that there is a differentiation between the Arabic numerals that we are frequently encountering in photography and these Roman numerals that describe each zone. In the PDF and also here in the podcast, I'll give you a group of these zones that will, in fact, make visual this idea of these zones. So zone 0 was black, and zone 10 is white, so that we look at anything brighter than zone 0 as being some shade of gray, or less than zone 10 as being some shade of lighter gray. So the idea of the zone system of laying out these values and laying them out in a particular way. That particular way is that each zone, as it relates to the zone next to it, is either twice as bright or twice as dark. It is in that same relationship of 1 to 2 that apertures and shutter speeds are in. So we have the exact same kind of relationship that we have with apertures and shutter speeds in the zones, so that moving one shutter speed or one aperture in one direction or another, more or less overall exposure, moves each tone in the picture up or down one zone. So the idea here of the zones not only having sort of a relationship to one another, but also occupying the entire tone scale that is possible in a photographic image. Now, in the PDF, you will see on page 6, you'll see a scale with verbal descriptions. And this was another important thing of the way in which Adams and his pals put together the zone system. Not only did they divvy up this scale into these 11 zones, and not only did they divvy up the scale into 11 zones that had a relationship of 1 to 2, twice as much, half as much, just like they were used to in apertures and shutter speeds. But they also, and I think this is really important, and it harkens to the idea of the creative photographer, they also put together verbal descriptions of each zone. So they said that zone 0 was total black in a photographic print. Talking about negatives, they said no useful density in the negative other than film base plus fog, the sort of chemical fog that was created by developing the piece of black and white film. Zone 1 was the effective exposure threshold of film, but from a print point of view, it was the first step above complete black in the print. It had slight tone, but didn't have texture. Zone 2, the first suggestion of texture, deep tonalities representing the darkest part of the image in which some slight detail is required. And these, by the way, are the words of Adams and his pals when they put this thing together. So zone 3, average dark material and low values showing adequate texture. Zone 4, average dark foliage, dark stone or landscape shadow, normal shadow value for Caucasian skin portraits in sunlight. Zone 5, listen to this part, Zone 5, middle gray, 18% reflectance. Sky as rendered by panchromatic film, dark skin, gray stone, weathered wood. So Zone 5, 18% reflectance or middle gray. So hopefully that rings a bell and kind of reminds you about that idea of the light meter wanting to see middle gray. Zone 6, average Caucasian skin in sunlight, diffuse skylight or artificial light, light stone, shadows on snow in sunlit landscapes. Zone 7, very light skin, light gray objects, snow with acute side lighting. Zone 8, whites with texture and delicate values, textured snow, highlights on Caucasian skin. Zone 9, white without texture approaching pure white, thus comparable to Zone 1 in its slight tonality without true texture, snow in flat sunlight. Zone 10, pure white of the printing paper base, specular glare or light sources in the picture area. So again, laying out these values, laying out the values of these zones in not only this relationship of 1 to 2, but also in a verbal relationship so that we can think about what these things look like relative to our photographic images. And remember, again, that Zone 5 is middle gray or 18% reflectance. So if we put this all together, and we remember that light meters, when they're confronted with objects in the world, want to make those objects middle gray. And the idea of being able to simplify the light meter's job by forcing it to see only one thing in the scene, something we typically do not do. Typically, we point the light meter in the camera at the scene's overall tones, and we say, there's the average of all of the tones. Well, with the zone system, the concept is different. The concept is to use the light meter to specifically target a particular tone in the scene. And simplify the light meter's job by forcing it to look at only one object so that it can tell us more about something that we find important in our scene. So if we combine that with the fact that we know that we can say either middle gray or zone 5 to describe what a light meter looks for, if we meter a single object in our scene and do exactly what the meter tells us to do, then we'll get a great picture of that object as a middle gray object. The picture will result in a correct exposure that will print best or look best as a middle gray object. So what if that object isn't middle gray? What if the most important thing in the scene is a dark gray sweater that our subject is wearing? Or what if the most important thing in our scene is one of those snow ideas that Adams laid out in his zone scale? Well, if we remember that the zones exist in the same 1 to 2 relationship that shutters and apertures do, each zone is exactly twice as light or twice as dark as the one next to it. If we create more exposure than the meter suggests by exactly 1 unit, we'll make the object 1 unit brighter. So we'll make it, instead of zone 5, we'll make it zone 6, exactly. Same deal on the other side. If we decide that the most important thing in our subject is the dark gray sweater that our subject is wearing, we want to make sure that that's recorded with texture. And what we do is we think, well, Based on this description of these tones, it seems to me that that sweater, that dark gray sweater, should be a zone 3. So we meter the sweater, and because it is 2 stops less than what the meter wants us to be, we then close down our aperture, or slow down our, or speed up rather, I'm sorry, our shutter speed, so that less exposure by 2 stops or 2 zones reaches the camera's sensor, whether it's the digital camera's sensor or the film in the camera. So the idea of making an exposure, basing our exposure on a single object, and finding out what happens when we decide that that object wants to be a particular value. Now, the question that always comes up at this point from people thinking about these concepts for the first time is, well, okay, what happens to the rest of the values in the scene? Well, nothing really. The rest of the values in the scene are still the same amount of reflectance that they always were before we began trying to think about what exact value we want a particular thing or particular group of things to be. So the idea here is, if we take this a step further, and we decide to have that object placed on a particular zone, and that's the one of the zone system pieces of terminology. We place a value on a particular zone or a particular tone. That what happens is that the rest of the objects in the scene fall into zones relative to their reflectance. And what we then need to do is think about that range of reflectance. But in the language of the zone system, when we look at a tone in a picture, we call it placing a tone. We decide that that's an important tone to us in this photograph. And again, color or black and white, it doesn't matter. We decide that that's an important tone. We meter it, and it alone, so that none of the rest of the scene interferes. And many of your cameras will have a spot meter function within them. Some of you probably already use handheld light meters, many of which either have a spot meter function, or you can just walk up to the scene and meter just this object or this area that is important to you. If it is a dark object, you're going to figure out how many tones or how many values darker than middle gray it should be, and close down the aperture or the shutter speed, either one, as many stops as you think ought to be closed. If it is lighter than middle gray, you get to decide. And the part that always confounds people is, well, what tone should I decide it should be? And the answer is whatever tone you, the photographer, wants it to be. Because here's what the beauty of this is. It allows you to take over that decision of how things work out in your photographs. You take it over from the camera's metering system into your own head, and quite frankly, you're smarter than the light meter, so your objective is to be able to think through how this works. So if the meter sees everything as middle gray, we can use it to measure both light things and dark things in our image and determine how far apart in reflectance they are. If the difference in reflectance between a dark object and a light object in our scene is 4 stops, and we can determine that by metering the two things and figuring out what the difference in exposure is. And if that difference is 4 stops and we place the dark object on zone 3, we can use simple math to add 4 stops or 4 zones to zone 3 and discover that the light object will end up as zone 7. So if the difference in distance is 4 stops, or a range of 4 stops of brightness, and we place the dark thing on zone 3, we discover that the light thing becomes zone 7. 3 plus 4 equals 7. Pretty simple stuff. And that's really it for the zone system. Now, a lot of people presume that the zone system is really complicated. And I suppose in some people's minds, complicating photography's technical issues is sort of their reason for living. That's what they like to do. They like to try and figure out how to make things really complex. And in fact, my objective is to make things really simple. I'd like to have photography be as simple as it can be, so that my time spent photographing is as productive as it can be. And I can spend a lot more time thinking about what it is that I'm photographing and why I'm photographing it, and figure out what it is that I'd like to do with the picture. So the concepts of the zone system are not complex. They are just related to the way in which photography works, and they are applicable to black and white photography with film, black and white photography with digital, color photography with film, and color photography with digital. And it doesn't matter how you do photography, but rather what matters is that you understand this set of technical considerations that we have to think about with regard to the medium. So, what I'll do in a subsequent episode, perhaps not the next one, to give you a little bit of time to absorb some of these concepts and make sure that everybody's sort of more or less on the same page before we move along. But what I'll do at some point is give you some more specifics about the way in which exactly this should work. So in between, we'll probably do a couple of other concepts here in camera position. If you're, by the way, by your computer listening to this, printing out that PDF form, if you get a chance, hop on over to the iTunes store and leave a comment. Especially leave a comment if you're enjoying camera position and the content you're finding here. And I'd appreciate that kind of support. That's very helpful to me in terms of trying to build the audience. And also, if you think of it and you can think of somebody who might enjoy this content, send them an email with a link to cameraposition.com, and we'll have the opportunity then to help them get access to this content. And again, if you think it's useful, send it on to a friend or two who might find it something that they might enjoy. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for putting up with the problems of the blog sort of timing out and things not working right and no feeds in your RSS feed reader and so forth and so on. But I think I've got all that stuff licked now, because what I've discovered is that every piece of creative work has to come with some little bit of technology attached to it. So there you go. And the reason for today's podcast about the Zone system has everything to do with understanding that relationship between the creative act and the technical problems that get in the way of that creative act. So thanks again for being here, and I hope to see you again next time on the next episode of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography.
Photocastnetwork.com, your photography resource in the podosphere. Photocastnetwork.com